bright yellow notice fluttered against my windshield like a dying butterfly. 5:30 in the morning, and I'm staring at a $2,850 fine for illegal landscaping. The wet earth from last night's rain mixed with the diesel fumes from my neighbor's generator, creating that sick, sweet smell that makes your stomach turn. I crumpled the paper in my fist, feeling my dad's old army dog tag press against my palm through my pocket. 40 years I'd been growing tomatoes on this land. 40 years since I buried that tag under the old oak where Dad used to sit and tell me stories about Korea. The sound of footsteps on wet gravel made me turn around. Kristen McBride marched across my lawn like she owned it, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it stretched her face into a permanent scowl. Behind her walked some guy in a county jacket, camera ready. "Mr. Anderson." Her voice could freeze July. "I trust you received our notice." "Your notice?" I held up the crumpled paper. "For growing vegetables on my own land?" She smiled, not a pleasant smile, the kind that makes you check your wallet. "Your land is subject to homeowners association guidelines. No agricultural use permitted." The inspector started snapping pictures of my tomato plants like they were evidence at a crime scene. Each click felt like a slap. "I've got the original deed from 1987. I pulled out the folder I'd grabbed from my truck. "Shows agricultural exemption clear as day." Kristen laughed, actually laughed. "Oh, sweetie, that paperwork's older than my marriage. Doesn't mean squat now." She turned to the inspector. "How much per day if he doesn't comply?" "It's $500 daily, plus forced removal at owner expense." My hands started shaking, not from fear, from rage. "Lady, you don't know who you're messing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Her eyes went cold. "A stubborn old man who thinks rules don't apply to him." The gate creaked under the morning wind, metal grinding against metal like fingernails on a chalkboard. That sound always reminded me of the farm equipment Dad used to fix in this same spot, back when this place meant something. 3 hours later, I found myself sitting in the community center, surrounded by 43 of my neighbors. The Emergency Homeowners Association meeting that Kristen had called to address the violations on Maple Street. She stood at the front with a laptop and projector, clicking through slides of my garden like it was a war zone. "As you can see," she announced, "Mr. Anderson has turned his property into an unauthorized farm. This affects all our property values." A young mother in the third row shot to her feet. "Because of people like him, our home values drop. I've got kids to think about." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, heads nodding, phones coming out to record. I tried to stand, tried to explain about the exemption, but the crowd started whistling and clapping to drown me out. "The fine is now $4,200, Kristen announced over the noise. "And growing." I sat there in that folding chair, surrounded by people I'd waved to for decades, and realized they were all strangers now. The smell of burnt coffee from the community center kitchen mixed with the cheap air freshener they'd sprayed to mask the mold problem they had been ignoring for years. After the meeting, a young guy approached me in the parking lot. Couldn't have been more than 28, nervous energy bouncing off him like static electricity. "Mr. Anderson, I'm Tommy Reynolds, new city clerk." He glanced around, making sure we were alone. "I was reviewing your file, and there's something in Section 15C of your original agreement. Something about exclusive rights." "Exclusive rights to what?" "That's just it. Pages 12 through 15 are missing from your file, torn out clean." He handed me a business card. "Might want to check your personal copies." That night, I spread every document I had across my kitchen table. Property deed, survey maps, water rights documentation. And there it was. Or rather, there it wasn't. Pages 12 through 15, gone. Ripped out so carefully I almost missed the tiny paper fragments still caught in the binding. Someone had been in my files. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for. Outside, a car door slammed in the darkness. That car door turned out to be Sheriff Collins making his evening rounds, but it left me jumpy for hours. I spent half the night digging through boxes in my basement, looking for backup copies of those missing pages. All I found were water stains and mouse droppings. The next morning, I drove straight to the county archive building. The clerk behind the bulletproof glass looked like she'd been there since the Carter administration. "I need to see the original land agreements for Woodland Estates," I told her. specifically the 1985 water rights documentation. She disappeared into the back for what felt like an hour. When she returned, she was carrying a thick manila folder and wearing a confused expression. Strange thing, Mr. Anderson. Someone else was asking about these same documents last week. Blonde lady, very insistent. My stomach dropped. What did you tell her? That same thing I'm telling you. The 1985 addendum is sealed pending resolution of a property dispute. What property dispute? She leaned closer to the glass. The one that was filed 3 days ago by a Kristen McBride. I walked out of that building feeling like I'd been sucker punched. Kristen hadn't just stumbled onto my garden violation. She'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. Getting access to documents, filing preemptive legal blocks, covering her tracks. But why? The answer started coming together when I stopped by Margaret Wilson's house that afternoon. Margaret had been the association secretary back in the 80s, and her memory for details was sharper than a prosecuting attorney's. Oh yes, I remember that water agreement, she said, pouring coffee that could strip paint. Your property had the only natural well in the development. The association got free water for 15 years in exchange for exempting you from landscaping restrictions. 15 years of free water? I set down my cup harder than I meant to. How much water are we talking about? Every drop for the community center, pool maintenance, and irrigation of common areas had to be worth thousands per year. I did the math in my head. 15 years of municipal water rates for a facility that size? We were talking about $40,000, maybe $50,000. Margaret, when did the association stop using my well? Her face went pale. Oh my, that would have been about 10 years ago when they connected to city water. But Jake, if the exemption was tied to the water usage, then I should have started paying landscaping fines 10 years ago. I finished her thought. Or the exemption should have been renewed. Margaret's hands started shaking as she reached for a photo album. I kept pictures from all the association meetings back then. Maybe there's something... She flipped through pages of community barbecues and holiday parties until she stopped at a picture from 1985. There was a younger version of me, shaking hands with a man in a suit while a small crowd watched. That's when they signed the water agreement, Margaret said. But look at this. She pointed to a woman in the background, partially hidden behind a group of residents. Blonde hair, sharp features, even back then carrying herself like she owned the place. Is that Kristen's mother? Margaret whispered. She was on the association board when they negotiated your water deal. The pieces started clicking together like a combination lock finding its numbers. Kristen wasn't just some power-hungry neighbor. This was personal. This was family business. My phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Stop digging or the fines double tomorrow. I showed the message to Margaret. Her coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. Jake, maybe you should just pay the fine and replant grass. With what money? I'm living on Social Security and my Navy pension. Then maybe it's time to sell. I looked out Margaret's window at my property next door, at the tomato plants that were probably already wilting from the stress of being photographed and measured like evidence in a murder trial. You know what Margaret used to tell me when I was deployed? I said. That the garden was the only thing keeping this place feeling like home. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Jake, I didn't mean... Margaret died 8 years ago, Mrs. Wilson. Lung cancer. But I kept that garden going because it was the last thing we built together. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Outside, I could hear the sound of lawnmowers and leaf blowers, the suburban symphony of people maintaining their perfect little squares of conformity. There's something else, Margaret finally said. Something I probably should have mentioned years ago. She walked to her kitchen drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Margaret asked me to give this to you if anything ever happened to your water arrangement. She said you'd know what to do with it. My hands trembled as I tore open the envelope. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note in my wife's careful script. The photograph showed Kristen's mother accepting what looked like a cash payment from a man I didn't recognize. The date stamp showed it was taken 3 months after our water agreement was signed. Margaret's note was brief. Jake, if they ever try to take the garden, this proves the water deal was never legitimate. The association was paid twice. I love you. M. I stared at that photograph until the faces burned into my memory. Then I looked up at Margaret Wilson, who was watching me with the careful attention of someone who'd been keeping secrets for decades. "Mrs. Wilson," I said quietly, "I think it's time we had a longer conversation about what really happened in 1985. Outside, a truck engine growled to life, and through the window, I saw Kristen McBride's white SUV pulling away from the curb across the street. She'd been watching us the whole time. Margaret Wilson locked her front door behind us and drew the curtains tight. The smell of old house and mothballs filled her living room as she settled into her recliner with a heavy sigh. Your wife was a smart woman, Jake, smarter than any of us gave her credit for. She pulled out a shoebox from underneath her coffee table. Inside were dozens of photographs, meeting minutes, and financial documents from the 80s. Margaret suspected something was wrong with that water deal from the very beginning. See, the association's books never quite added up after 1985. She handed me a ledger with Margaret's handwriting in the margins, numbers circled in red ink, question marks scattered across the pages like accusations. The association was getting free water from your well, but they were also billing residents for water usage. Double dipping, your wife called it. How much money are we talking about? Over 15 years? Close to $60,000. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. But here's the thing, Jake. That money didn't go into the association's general fund. She pointed to a bank statement from 1987. It went into a private account controlled by 3 board members, including Kristen's mother. My blood pressure spiked so fast I could hear it in my ears. They stole from the neighborhood for 15 years? Worse than that, when the city water connection happened 10 years ago, they kept charging residents the same rates, told everyone it was for infrastructure maintenance. I studied the documents spread across her coffee table, financial records, photographs, meeting minutes. It was all there, a paper trail of corruption stretching back decades. Mrs. Wilson, why didn't you report this years ago? Her hands twisted in her lap. Because 3 years after that photo was taken, my husband got a visit from some very serious men, told him that accidents happen to people who ask too many questions. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. What kind of accidents? The kind that look natural but aren't. Heart attacks, car crashes, house fires. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what she was telling me. You're saying they killed people to keep this quiet? I'm saying that 5 people who asked questions about association finances died within a 2-year period, and I'm saying that my husband lived another 20 years after he stopped asking questions. My phone rang. Unknown number again. Last warning, Anderson. Drop this or lose everything. This time, there was no mistaking the threat in the voice. Male, younger than me, with an accent I couldn't place. Margaret grabbed my arm. Jake, you need to be very careful. These people have been protecting this secret for 40 years. Then it's time someone exposed them. I gathered up the documents and photographs, stuffing them into a manila envelope. I'm taking these to the police. The police? Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. Jake, who do you think has been getting association contracts for security services all these years? My stomach dropped. You're telling me the cops are in on this? I'm telling you that Sheriff Collins' brother-in-law owns the company that's been overcharging the association for lawn maintenance since 1992. I walked to her front window and peeked through the curtains. Kristen's SUV was gone, but there was a black sedan parked at the end of the street that I didn't recognize. How deep does this go? Deep enough that your little garden violation isn't really about landscaping rules. Margaret joined me at the window. It's about you getting too close to something that could bring down half the power structure in this town. The black sedan's engine started up. It drove slowly past Margaret's house, the driver's face hidden behind tinted windows. They know I'm here, I said. They've known about every move you've made since yesterday morning. Margaret pulled out her cell phone. Jake, I think it's time you met someone who might be able to help. She dialed a number and spoke quietly for a few minutes. When she hung up, she was smiling for the first time since I'd arrived. Tommy Reynolds isn't just a city clerk. His father was one of the original association board members who got pushed out when Kristen's mother took over. The one who died in that car accident? The one who was murdered to look like a car accident. Margaret's smile turned grim. Tommy's been waiting 20 years for someone brave enough to help him prove it. She handed me a business card with an address written on the back. Meet him tonight at 8, the old grain elevator on Route 9. Why there? Because it's the only place in town without association security cameras. I pocketed the card and headed for the door. As I reached for the handle, Margaret called out, "Jake, your wife's last letter mentioned something else. She said if anything happened to her, you should check the well on your property." "Check it for what?" "She didn't say, just that you'd know what to look for when the time came." I walked back to my truck, feeling like I was carrying dynamite in my jacket pocket. The manila envelope full of evidence felt heavier with each step. As I climbed into the driver's seat, my phone buzzed with a text message. This time, it was from a number I recognized, Kristen McBride. It's funny how people who dig too deep sometimes fall into their own holes. I looked up at Margaret's house. She was standing in her front window, and for the first time I noticed how scared she looked. That's when I realized the black sedan hadn't left the neighborhood. It had just moved closer. I drove home taking 3 different routes, checking my mirrors every few seconds. The black sedan stayed with me for the first 2 miles, then disappeared somewhere near the highway on-ramp. Either they'd given up, or they already knew where I was going. Back at my house, I walked straight to the old well behind my garden. It had been capped with concrete for over a decade, but Margaret's words kept echoing in my head. What had my wife wanted me to find? The concrete cap had a hairline crack running down the middle that I'd never noticed before. When I knelt down and ran my fingers along it, I realized it wasn't a crack at all. It was a seam. The cap had been cut in half and fitted back together so perfectly that you'd never see it unless you knew what to look for. I grabbed a crowbar from my shed and worked the blade into the seam. The cap lifted easier than it should have, revealing a metal box wrapped in plastic, suspended just below the surface on a rope. Inside the box were more photographs, financial documents, and a handwritten letter from Margaret. "My dearest Jake," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then the truth is finally coming out. What I discovered about the water deal was just the beginning. The association has been laundering money for outside contractors for over 20 years. The well was perfect for hiding evidence because everyone assumed it was just an old water source." My hands shook as I read further. "The real reason they want your land isn't about garden violations. There's a new development plan for the empty lot behind your property. The contractors need access to your well for illegal dumping of construction waste. Kristen's been promised a $50,000 kickback once the sale goes through." I looked up at the empty lot she'd mentioned. I'd always assumed it was just undeveloped land, but now I could see fresh tire tracks leading back into the trees. The letter continued. "I've hidden backup copies of all the financial records in the place where we first kissed. You'll remember. And Jake, if anything happens to me, promise me you won't let them destroy what we built together." The place where we first kissed. The oak tree where I'd buried Dad's dog tag. I was halfway across the yard when my phone rang. Sheriff Collins. "Jake, we need to talk. There's been a complaint filed against you for harassment and trespassing." "Harassment? I haven't harassed anyone." "Kristen McBride says you've been threatening her and going through private association documents." I stopped walking. "Those weren't private documents, Sheriff. They were stolen from my property." "Well, that's something we'll need to sort out. Can you come down to the station?" "When?" "Now would be good." Through my kitchen window, I could see the black sedan parked across the street again. The driver was talking on a phone. "But Sheriff, I think I'm going to need a lawyer before we have that conversation." "Jake, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just come in and we'll clear this up." I hung up and immediately called Tommy Reynolds. "They're moving faster than we expected," he said when I explained the situation. "Meet me at the grain elevator in 1 hour, and Jake, bring everything you found." "What about the sheriff?" "Collins is dirty, but he's not stupid. He won't arrest you without more evidence. They're trying to scare you into making a mistake." I gathered up all the documents from the well and the envelope Margaret Wilson had given me. As I was loading them into my truck, I noticed Mrs. Patterson from next door watching me through her kitchen window. She waved and walked out to her mailbox. "Everything okay, Jake? I saw some men in suits asking questions about you this morning." "What kind of questions?" "About your finances, your health, whether you had any family nearby." She lowered her voice. "One of them asked if I thought you were mentally stable." The pieces were falling into place. They weren't just trying to steal my land. They were building a case to have me declared incompetent. Mrs. Patterson, if anything happens to me, I want you to call this number. I wrote Tommy Reynolds' contact information on the back of a grocery receipt. Tell him about the men in suits. Jake, you're scaring me. Good, that means you're paying attention. I drove to the grain elevator by the longest possible route, stopping twice to make sure I wasn't being followed. The old building looked like a monument to better times, its concrete silos reaching up into the darkening sky like fingers. Tommy was waiting in the shadows between two storage buildings, nervousness radiating off him like heat. Did you bring the documents? I handed him the manila envelopes. He pulled out a flashlight and started examining the photographs and financial records. This is it, he whispered. This is everything we need to prove the corruption. Tommy, there's something else. I think they're planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. His flashlight stopped moving. That would give them legal authority to handle your property affairs, including selling my land. Jake, we need to move fast. I've got a contact at the state attorney general's office who can protect these documents, but we need to get them out of town tonight. A car engine echoed across the empty parking lot. We both froze. Expecting anyone? I whispered. Tommy shook his head and clicked off his flashlight. The black sedan pulled up to the grain elevator and parked directly under the security light. Two men got out. Even from 50 yards away, I could see they weren't local law enforcement. Back exit? I asked. Through the loading dock. We crept along the side of the building, staying in the shadows. The loading dock was 20 feet above ground level, but there was a rusty fire escape ladder. That's when my phone rang. Kristen McBride's voice was sugar-sweet and venomous. Jake, you missed your appointment with the sheriff. That's not very neighborly. I muted the phone, but kept listening. I know you're at the grain elevator, and I know Tommy Reynolds is with you. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk out to the parking lot with your hands visible and get in the car with my associates. Tommy grabbed my arm and pointed to the fire escape. We started climbing. If you run, Jake, I'll make sure everyone in town knows about your mental health issues, the forgetfulness, the paranoid accusations, the way you've been threatening innocent neighbors. We reached the loading dock just as footsteps echoed inside the building below us. And Jake, that nice Mrs. Patterson who's been watching out for you, it would be terrible if something happened to her for getting involved in things that don't concern her. I stopped climbing. Tommy looked back at me with panic in his eyes. Jake, don't listen to her. They're bluffing. But I was thinking about Mrs. Patterson waving from her kitchen window, asking innocent questions about my day, about Margaret Wilson, terrified in her living room full of secrets, about my wife's letter, asking me not to let them destroy what we'd built together. Below us, a door slammed open and flashlight beams started sweeping the loading dock. Time's up, gentlemen. I made a decision that probably saved both our lives. Instead of climbing down to face Kristen's associates, I grabbed Tommy's arm and pulled him toward the grain chute opening at the far end of the loading dock. Are you insane? He whispered. Trust me. We dropped through the chute into a pile of old grain that cushioned our fall. The musty smell of decades-old wheat filled my nostrils as we scrambled through the darkness toward what I hoped was another exit. Behind us, voices echoed through the building, angry voices that were getting closer. There's got to be a service tunnel, I whispered to Tommy. These old elevators always had underground connections to the rail lines. We felt our way along the concrete wall until my fingers found a metal door, rusted but unlocked. It opened onto a narrow tunnel that stretched into blackness. Jake, I can't see anything. Just follow my voice and keep one hand on the wall. We stumbled through that tunnel for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When we finally emerged, we were 3 blocks away near the old railroad depot. My truck's back at the grain elevator, I said. We can't go back there. Tommy pulled out his cell phone. I'm calling my contact at the state attorney general's office. At 9 o'clock at night? This can't wait until morning. While Tommy made his call, I tried to process what had just happened. Kristen McBride had just threatened to harm Mrs. Patterson, an innocent 70-year-old woman whose only crime was being neighborly. That's when I realized this had gone way beyond property disputes and association corruption. These people were dangerous. Tommy finished his call and walked back to me. Good news and bad news? Give me the bad news first. My contact says the state attorney general's office can't move on this evidence until they verify its authenticity. That could take weeks. And the good news? He's sending someone to meet us tomorrow morning, someone who can put us in protective custody if necessary. A police siren wailed in the distance, growing louder. Think that's for us? I asked. Let's not find out. We started walking toward the residential area, staying off the main roads. I knew these streets like the back of my hand, but everything looked different in the darkness, more threatening. Tommy, what do you know about your father's death? He was quiet for a long moment. Officially, single car accident on a rainy night. Lost control on a curve he'd driven 1,000 times. Unofficially, 2 witnesses saw another car leave the scene, but their statements disappeared from the police report. We turned onto Elm Street, still 6 blocks from my house. That's when I saw the fire trucks. Orange flames were reaching up into the night sky from the direction of my neighborhood. The acrid smell of burning wood and plastic carried on the wind. Jesus, Tommy whispered. Is that... I started running. My house was gone. Not damaged, not partially burned. Gone. The fire department was still hosing down the smoking foundation, but there was nothing left to save. Fire Chief Morrison walked over when he saw me standing there. Jake, I'm sorry. We got the call about 20 minutes ago, but by the time we arrived... What started it? Too early to tell. Could have been electrical. Old houses like yours, wiring gets brittle. I looked at the smoking remains of 40 years of my life. Photo albums, furniture, my wife's clothes that I'd never been able to bring myself to donate. All of it reduced to ash and twisted metal. But what hit me hardest was the garden. The tomato plants that Margaret and I had planted together were now blackened stumps in scorched earth. Chief Morrison, I said quietly, were there any witnesses? Mrs. Patterson next door called it in, said she saw flames through your kitchen window around 8:30. I looked over at Mrs. Patterson's house. The windows were dark and her car wasn't in the driveway. Where is she now? Hospital, smoke inhalation. She tried to get close enough to see if you were inside. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. Mrs. Patterson was in the hospital because she'd tried to save me from a fire that was set to destroy evidence of a crime I was trying to expose. Tommy grabbed my shoulder. Jake, we need to get out of here. If they burned your house, they're not done. They destroyed everything? Not everything. He held up his cell phone. I photographed all those documents before we ran. Every page, every financial record, every piece of evidence. A black SUV turned onto my street and slowed as it passed the fire trucks. Kristen McBride was in the passenger seat, surveying the destruction with satisfaction. She rolled down her window as the SUV passed us. That's such a shame about your house, Jake. But look on the bright side. Now you don't have to worry about those landscaping violations anymore. The SUV accelerated away before I could respond. Chief Morrison was studying the burned foundation with a flashlight. Jake, there's something odd here. The fire started in multiple locations simultaneously. Kitchen, bedroom, and basement. What does that mean? It means this wasn't an electrical fire. He walked closer to where my kitchen used to be and knelt down beside something metallic in the ash. When he stood up, he was holding a melted plastic container. Gasoline can, he said simply. Tommy pulled out his phone again. I'm calling my contact back. This is officially attempted murder. As he dialed, I walked to where the oak tree used to shade my backyard. The fire had damaged the lower branches, but the trunk was still solid. I knelt down at the base of the tree and started digging with my bare hands. 6 inches down, my fingers found what I was looking for. Dad's dog tag, warm from the fire but intact. And wrapped around it, a small metal key that I'd never seen before. On the key was a number, 1247. Margaret's final message. She'd known they would eventually come for the house, so she'd hidden something else. Something they couldn't burn. Storage unit 1247. I looked back at the smoking ruins of my life and realized that Kristen McBride had just made her biggest mistake. She'd given me nothing left to lose. Tommy and I drove to the storage facility in his beat-up Honda, taking back roads and checking mirrors every few seconds. The key felt warm in my palm, like it was carrying the heat of everything I'd lost. Storage Max was one of those sprawling complexes on the edge of town. The kind of place where people keep the pieces of their lives they can't bear to throw away, but don't have room to keep. Unit 1247 was in the back corner, away from the security lights. The key turned easily, and the metal door rolled up with a screech that sounded like a wounded animal. Inside was a treasure trove that made my heart stop. Filing cabinets lined the walls, each drawer labeled with years spanning from 1985 to 2010. Boxes of photographs sat stacked on shelves, and in the center of the space was a desk with a computer that looked ancient but functional. "Your wife was a busy woman," Tommy whispered. I opened the first filing cabinet. It was full of financial records, phone bills, meeting minutes, and correspondence that painted a picture of corruption so deep it took my breath away. The association hadn't just been stealing water fees. They'd been running a full-scale money laundering operation, funneling payments to contractors who never did work, billing residents for services they never received, and skimming off the top of every community improvement project for 25 years. "Tommy, look at this." I handed him a folder labeled Municipal Contracts 1995 to 2000. Inside were copies of invoices for road work, snow removal, and landscaping services. But the addresses didn't match any streets in our development. They were billing our residents for work done in other towns, Tommy said. Work that probably never happened at all. "How much money are we talking about?" He pulled out a calculator and started adding numbers. Over 25 years, close to $2 million. I sank into the desk chair and powered up the old computer. It wheezed to life like an ancient engine, but the desktop was organized with military precision. Folders labeled by year, subcategories for different types of fraud, and a master spreadsheet that tracked every stolen dollar back to its source. Margaret had been building a case for decades. "Jake, there's something else here." Tommy was holding a video camera. "Looks like she recorded conversations." We found dozens of mini tapes, each labeled with dates and names. I picked one at random. KB and Associates, March 15th, 2003. KB, Kristen's mother, Karen Blake. We plugged the camera into the computer and watched grainy footage of a woman who looked exactly like Kristen, 20 years younger, sitting across from two men in expensive suits. "The Anderson problem needs to be resolved," the woman was saying. "He's asking too many questions about the water usage reports." "What kind of resolution are we talking about?" "Nothing permanent, just enough to keep him distracted. Maybe a health scare, some financial pressure." One of the men leaned forward. "We could arrange an audit of his business license. Small contractors hate dealing with that kind of scrutiny." "Perfect. And if that doesn't work, there are other options." The recording continued for another 10 minutes, detailing plans to harass me into submission or force me to sell my property. But what chilled me to the bone was the casual way they discussed destroying someone's life. "They've been planning this for 20 years, I said. Tommy ejected the tape and grabbed several others. "Jake, we need to get these to my contact immediately. This is RICO territory now." "RICO?" "Racketeering, organized crime, the kind of charges that put people away for decades." I was loading files into boxes when my phone rang. Unknown number. "Mr. Anderson, this is Dr. Phillips at Regional Medical Center. I'm calling about Mrs. Patterson." My blood turned to ice. "Is she okay?" "She's stable, but she's been asking for you. She says she has something important to tell you about what she saw tonight." "I'll be right there." "Mr. Anderson, she specifically said to tell you to be careful who you trust. She said someone was watching your house before the fire started." I hung up and looked at Tommy. "Mrs. Patterson saw something. It could be a trap." "Then it's a trap I'm walking into." We loaded the most important files into Tommy's car and drove to the hospital. The parking lot was nearly empty, but I spotted a familiar black sedan parked near the emergency room entrance. "They're here," Tommy said. "Then we go in the back way." We parked at the far end of the lot and walked through the main entrance like we belonged there. I'd visited this hospital enough over the years to know the layout. Mrs. Patterson was in room 314, hooked up to oxygen but alert. When she saw me, tears started streaming down her face. "Jake, I'm so sorry. I tried to warn you, but they said they'd hurt my grandson if I called." "Who said that?" "Two men in suits. They showed me pictures of little Billy at school, knew his teacher's name, knew what time he gets on the bus." Her voice was barely a whisper. "They said if I made any calls or left my house, something would happen to him." "What did you see, Mrs. Patterson?" "They doused your house with gasoline at 8 o'clock. 3 men with gas cans, working fast. I watched from my bedroom window. She gripped my hand with surprising strength. But Jake, that's not the worst part. The woman who was directing them, I recognized her. Kristen McBride? No, it was someone else. Someone I hadn't seen in years. She reached for the bedside table and pulled out a newspaper clipping that looked decades old. I kept this from when she died, or when we thought she died. I looked at the clipping. It was an obituary from 1995. Margaret Anderson, beloved wife of Jake Anderson, died peacefully after a long battle with lung cancer. But the photograph next to the obituary wasn't my wife. It was a woman I'd never seen before. Mrs. Patterson squeezed my hand tighter. Jake, I don't know who you buried 8 years ago, but it wasn't your wife. The room started spinning. 25 years of marriage, 8 years of grief, and I was looking at the obituary of a complete stranger. Mrs. Patterson, where is my wife? She was there tonight, Jake, directing those men who burned your house. My legs gave out and I sank into the visitor's chair. The woman I thought was dead has been alive this whole time, working with Kristen McBride to steal my land and destroy the evidence of their crimes. Tommy grabbed the newspaper clipping from my hands. Jake, if she faked her death, she's been planning this for 8 years, maybe longer. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Visiting hours are over, gentlemen. But it wasn't a nurse. It was one of the men from the grain elevator, wearing scrubs that didn't fit and a smile that made my skin crawl. Mrs. Patterson needs her rest. I stood up slowly, my mind still reeling from what I'd learned. Tommy, I said quietly, I think we're about to find out just how deep this goes. The fake nurse stepped aside to let us pass, but as we walked toward the elevator, I could feel him following us. The elevator doors opened, and standing inside was the woman from the obituary photograph. My wife, very much alive, and pointing a gun directly at my chest. Hello, Jake. We need to talk. The woman I'd mourned for 8 years looked exactly the same, except for the hardness in her eyes that I'd never seen before. The gun in her hand was steady, professional. Margaret? My voice came out like a croak. Get in the elevator, Jake. Both of you. Tommy started to back away, but the fake nurse behind us produced his own weapon. I wouldn't, Margaret said calmly. Mr. Reynolds has been very useful, but his usefulness has limits. We stepped into the elevator. The doors closed with a soft ding that sounded like a funeral bell. 8 years, I said. 8 years I mourned you. And 8 years I spent building the biggest real estate development deal this county has ever seen. She pressed the button for the basement level. Your little garden was standing in the way of a $40 million project. So you faked your death? Lung cancer is very convenient. Lots of privacy, closed casket funerals, sympathy from the neighbors. The elevator descended into darkness. I've been living quite comfortably in Phoenix while Kristen managed the local operations. Tommy found his voice. The financial records, the corruption evidence, you planted all of that? Margaret laughed. I created all of that. 25 years of fake financial crimes to hide one real crime. The systematic acquisition of every piece of property in Woodland Estates for development. The elevator stopped at the basement level. The doors opened onto a parking garage where Kristen McBride was waiting beside a black van. Took you long enough, Kristen said. The buyers are getting impatient. Buyers? I asked. Chinese Development Consortium, Margaret explained as we walked toward the van. They're building a manufacturing complex that'll employ 2,000 people. Very good for the local economy. And very good for your bank account. $47 million, split between myself, Kristen, and our associates. She gestured to the fake nurse, who was holding a chloroform-soaked cloth. Unfortunately, you and Mr. Reynolds won't be around to see the groundbreaking ceremony. That's when Tommy did something that probably saved both our lives. Instead of trying to run or fight, he pulled out his cell phone and held it up. I've been live streaming this entire conversation to the State Attorney General's office. Margaret's face went white. That's impossible. Emergency protocol. Anytime a protected witness is in danger, the stream activates automatically. He showed her the screen, where a red recording light was blinking. Say hello to the FBI, Margaret. The fake nurse lunged for the phone, but I was ready for him. 8 years of grief had built up a lot of rage, and I channeled all of it into a right hook that dropped him like a sack of cement. Kristen started running toward the exit stairs, but Tommy was faster. He tackled her before she reached the door, and they both went down hard on the concrete floor. Margaret still had the gun, but she was backing away from us now, panic replacing the cold confidence she'd shown in the elevator. Jake, you don't understand. The development will bring jobs, prosperity. It'll bring $47 million to your offshore accounts. We can split it, all of us. No one has to get hurt. I walked toward her slowly, Dad's dog tag warm in my pocket. You killed the woman I loved 8 years ago. The Margaret I married would never have done this. I am the woman you married. No, you're something else wearing her face. Sirens echoed from the street level above us. Real sirens this time, getting closer. Margaret looked around desperately, then raised the gun toward Tommy. If I can't have the money, nobody can. I dove between them just as she pulled the trigger. The bullet caught me in the shoulder, spinning me around, but I managed to knock the gun from her hand before I hit the ground. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but I forced myself to stay conscious. Margaret stood over me, and for just a moment, I saw a flicker of the woman I'd loved. I'm sorry, Jake. I really am. Then she ran for the stairs. Tommy helped me sit up against a concrete pillar. The FBI is 2 minutes out. Can you hang on? Did we get them? We got everything. The livestream recorded their confessions, the financial records from the storage unit, the videotapes your wife made. It's over. But it wasn't over, not for me. 3 months later, I was sitting in a courtroom watching Margaret and Kristen get sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The Chinese development deal was canceled, the association was dissolved, and every resident of Woodland Estates got a check for their share of the stolen money. I used mine to buy Mrs. Patterson's house and turn both our lots into a community garden. The doctors said my shoulder would never be quite right, but my hands still worked fine for planting tomatoes. On sunny mornings, I sit under the old oak tree with Dad's dog tag in my pocket and think about the Margaret I used to know. The one who helped me plant that first garden 40 years ago. She's buried next to the woman whose identity she stole, in a cemetery plot that bears her real name. Sometimes neighbors stop by to help with the garden. Kids from the elementary school come by after classes to learn about growing vegetables. Mrs. Patterson brings me coffee every morning at 7, and we talk about everything except that night at the hospital. The community garden feeds 30 families now. Fresh tomatoes, peppers, corn, and beans. All grown on land that was supposed to become a parking lot for a manufacturing plant that would have poisoned the groundwater for generations. Have you ever planted something knowing you might not live to see it fully grown? That's what hope feels like. It's what love looks like when it survives betrayal. I've got Dad's dog tag buried under the new oak saplings I planted last spring. In 40 years, someone else will sit in their shade and wonder about the old man who used to grow the best tomatoes in the county. That's legacy. That's what survives when everything else burns down. The garden is open every day from sunrise to sunset. Come by if you're ever in the neighborhood. I'll be the guy with the crooked shoulder, teaching kids how to tell when the tomatoes are ready to pick.